Hey guys, last week I had some free time in the shop. It was rain day, and I decided to make this oak step stool out of some scrap wood. It's a sturdy, stable little step, and I thought I would share it with you and how to do it. And there's a couple of fun things that I did with this. The benefits of using oak is that it is a sturdy, strong wood. It's stable. And the design, it's just a simple design. There's basically these 4 parts, right? As far as the dimensions go, it's 9 inches front to back, 12 inches across, and about 10 inches high. The legs, if you look, the legs taper, so it's 9 inches at the stool top. The legs taper from 9 to 7.5 where it connects at the bottom of the stool. The legs also angle out about 5 degrees on either end, this way, and that's done for additional stability side to side. And for this leg connection to the top, I use what's called a hidden dado. A hidden dado is for those times when you don't want to see the dado or the joint on your finished product. You want to stop it prior to coming out of the edge of your wood. So basically the angled leg connection, or angled dado, because you have to also angle your dado, is probably the most difficult joint, or the most difficult process of this whole build. And it's not that difficult. I'll detail this a little bit more in a few minutes. To connect these legs together though, to finish the product, I just put a simple stretcher between the 2 legs. And that stretcher is basically screwed in with 2 screws on both sides and finished off with some oak plugs and sanded flush to dress it up. Okay, to finish, or to prevent the legs from rocking, I actually cut this decorative little half round in it so that you didn't have the leg going all the way across and it could rock in the middle. I wanted to separate that. Let's move on to talking about the stock and what you need to build this project, this particular stool. I use scrap from my pile, so it's a mismatch of wood, but if I was going to do this as a project and I went out to buy the wood for it, I would buy a 1x10, 5 feet long. That's going to give you just enough oak to do this project. You can basically get your 2 sides, your top, and your stretcher out of a 5-foot piece. I also suggest that you rip that 1x10 down the middle, right in half, and then re-glue it. And you do that to prevent cupping. And then once that's done, you can clean that off, sand it, dress it up, and everything you need, all your parts, can come from that board. So before we go on though, I do want to talk about warping and cupping, because I think it is important to know for tops. When gluing up boards, especially wider boards, I always think about grain direction, because that's the way I was taught, and cupping. So it's often recommended that you reverse your grain. So you cut the board in half, you reverse it, glue it back together, and you alternate reversing to minimize that warping or curving tendency in the wood. And that, again, that was the way I was taught. And there's a big debate on whether that's needed or not, but more importantly for stability is to just make sure that your boards are no more than approximately 4 inches wide. So if you cut this down to 9 inches, rip it down in half, glue it back together, you're good to go. Glue it up, good to go. Just remember, narrower is better. I would also suggest, like I said, you would rip this. We know our stool top is 9 inches. Rip the entire board down to 9 inches and then cut all your parts from that, because everything is 9. This is 9. This wide portion of your legs is 9 as well. Just easy to do. All right, let's talk a little bit about making the stool top. So basically it's a square. You measure and cut it to size. And then I wanted the top to have 3/4 overhang on all 4 sides. One, so you could grab it with your hands. Just looks good, nice shadow lines. So to do this, just lay it bottoms up and lay out your dados. So I know that I was going to be 3/4 in on both sides. I laid out my dado. That determined my taper on my legs. My legs ended up being 9 inches to 7.5 inch taper. Worked out great. That's how I did that. And when I was creating the legs, I basically marked my tapers onto my legs, the parts that I was going to use for my legs, and you cut that taper on a miter saw. I then used a round measuring cup and a combination square to cut this decorative cutout on the legs out, and just use a jigsaw to make that cut. You could use a bandsaw for that matter. All right, let's go over to the router table and talk about creating that hidden angled dado. The most common type of dado joint is a through dado. And it's made by cutting the groove directly through on both ends of the boards. The router bit or a dado bit could make this cut, and it just goes right through the boards. I didn't want my dado to show on the end and try to figure out how to cover that or have it show, so I chose to use a hidden dado. The trick to doing a hidden dado is to use marks on the board. So where the workpiece meets the router bit to guide your cut, as well as marks where to start and stop your cut. Now, when your piece is short or narrow, you can sometimes mark the fence here, and you can just use those marks on your fence. When you're routing taller, larger, or your piece is hiding the router bit and you can't see, that's when you need to mark the table. And I made reference marks on the table. I just put some blue tape here and basically lined up the start and stop part of my router bit. And the reference marks on the router table basically show me where that router bit is located. The marks on the workpiece correspond to this line, and they tell me where to start and stop my cut in relation to that router tip. So one tip I'd give is for stool stability, I designed my legs to kind of angle out, right? We talked about that 5-degree bevel. To determine that leg angle, or angled dado, which is what I'm going to cut, I just basically, I did a little trial and error, and I came up with a 1/2-inch shim spacer, just a piece of plywood cut down. Like I said, took some trial and error, but this gave me a 5-degree angle, which seemed right to me. I just taped the shim to the opposite side, and that gave me my tapered edge. Now, let's talk about the drop cutting routing steps. The first thing you want to do is you want to line up and make sure that your router fence lines up with your dado cut. Now, I marked my dado and I marked my line, so I was able to do that and line it up. When it's flat, it changes a little on angle, so sometimes you have to make that adjustment. Then you want to make sure that your cut is visible throughout your entire routing process, and I did that by marking the top of my table stool. And then I used scrap wood to kind of make sure that I got it right. I used a few blocks and a few pieces to run it through. I also used a block of wood to line up my marks, or you could use you saw me use a framing square as well. The block of wood could be used to line up and make your mark as well. So that's another tip that you could do. Now, once your router bit is set to the proper height, the blue tape is marked. I've got my 1/2-inch strip taped on here, which I haven't done yet. Cutting this through will create a 5-degree tapered dado. So let's do that now. Let's just tape that down real quick. Okay. So with the workpiece against the fence like this, I can start my cut by lining it up to my lines and literally just drop it down, lower the work down onto the router bit, and then I start my cut and I push the work through slowly until I get to the end mark. I'll show you what that looks like as soon as I can get this tape to stick. All right, I'm going to reset the camera so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. All right, here is my start line right here, and here is my finish line, and they correspond to the start and stop on the router bit right here. So what I'll do is I will line these lines up, this line here to that. I'll drop down on my router bit, push through. Here's my stop line right here until I get to there and lift up. Okay, so here is my hidden dado. It's at a 5-degree angle, and by the way, I didn't adjust my fence for that 5 degrees, and you can see the line. It did move off where I drew my dado, moved about 1/8 of an inch off. I should have probably put the shim on, then adjusted the fence. I had this flat when I adjusted the fence, so that changed a little bit. But you can see where the dado starts and stops. I'll have to clean this up a little bit with a chisel and make it deeper as well. Make it about 3/8 of an inch deep into this top. All right, guys, I want to talk to you now about using scrap material in dry fitting parts. I constantly test my joints first on scrap pieces of wood like this, then I dry fit all my parts to ensure I'm not making a costly mistake or I'm on track. It gives me a good visual on how things fit and are lining up, as well as if things look square. Speaking of square, it's time to square off that dado that we cut on the router. And you can see how it's rounded here. Prior to fitting the legs into the dado, we need to use a chisel and basically just chisel and clean up those dado ends so that they're nice and square. When we're done with that, I take everything over to the router table and I ease the edges and I pre-sand everything. Because once the stool is assembled, it's really difficult to sand, especially near the stretcher part of the stool. So again, I dry fit everything. Everything looks good. I then take it to the router and I use an edge easing bit, and I just basically ease every single edge and take the sharp edges off of this. Then I sand all surfaces with 80 grit to take off the mill glaze and 120 grit to smooth it off prior to assembling. All right, with the legs in the stool now, we're starting to assemble. I'm gonna mark, we're still dry fitting, but I marked the location of my stretcher on the inside of the legs in here. And then I pre-drill with a small drill bit through the outside. And I do that so that I can find the location for my countersink. Each leg is going to have 2 screws securing that stretcher like we talked about. So I use a countersink to come from the other side and countersink big enough for a screw head and an oak plug to hide the screws. Final assembly involves gluing the legs up into the dado, the stool top dado, installing the 2 fasteners on each side, and then clamping the top down to the legs. And I let it dry overnight. Once that glue is cured, I then cut oak plugs. I went over to my drill press and I cut some oak plugs with a plug cutter on my drill. And I just use a little flathead screwdriver, break the plugs off, put some glue on them, I insert them in, and then you want to make sure that the grain on the plugs goes in the same direction as the grain on your legs. Just a nicer look. And then once that's dry, I'll use a chisel and chisel off those plugs and sand them flush. All right, the very last step is to bevel the leg feet. Now I knew that I had a 5-degree bevel on my legs, and that would relate to a 5-degree bevel on the feet. The goal though is to get 100% contact with the floor. You don't want anything rocking or not 100% in contact. I use the table saw to do this because the leg bases and the stool top are the same dimension. I clamped a square to the stool and kept everything kind of lined up just to kind of as a redundant layer as a security measure to keep me square. But look, if you're unsure of the bevel angle of your legs, or maybe you can't figure that out, or it doesn't fit on the table saw, the top is a different size, you can always put the stool down on a table or the floor and scribe it. And then when that's done and everything is ready, I sand the entire stool, clean it up, take the dust off it, and apply my finish. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. It's a simple stool, but it's a keepsake. I've had one for 30 years. This is my Gen 2. If you enjoyed the video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe. We need your support, and hit that notification bell. And don't forget, leave me a comment. I love hearing from you guys. I'm Rob Robillard. We'll see you next time.